Welcome to today's panel on free speech in contemporary society. This panel is part of Free Speech Week, which is a yearly event organized by the Moody College to raise awareness of the importance of freedom of speech and the freedom of the press in our democracy, and to celebrate it. My name is Teresa Frontado. I am the executive editor at KUT, the NPR member station here in Austin, and I'm sure, or hopefully, many of you have walked by our station, which is right there on campus. I'll be your moderator today in a conversation with Moody scholars Mary Angela Bock, Mirasol Enriquez, Scott Stroud, and Sam Woolley. I want to thank the organizers of this event for the invitation to discuss a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So much that my children joke around about how many more representations of the First Amendment can we have in our house. We have mugs, we have t-shirts, we have mouse pads, we have pins, we have posters of different sizes. So I'm just gonna let this be the first example of some of the tensions around the First Amendment. What they see as parental efforts in propaganda, I see as tasteful decorating choices that reinforce democratic values. So let's take a minute to read the First Amendment one more time. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. As a citizen and a journalist, my day-to-day life is defined by the rights afforded under the First Amendment and the limits to those rights. Day-to-day decisions that we make in our newsrooms fall within that space and frequently test these limits. Before the courts and the scholars have the time to unpack situations that challenge our assumptions about these freedoms, newsrooms have to deal with them. That's why conversations like the one we're having today are so necessary. In a remarkable year when newsrooms around the world have been challenged from all fronts, I debated what to bring to the table today. I could have talked about how the collapse of the traditional business model is impacting what newsrooms publish. I could have explained how events this summer have put into question the value system and power structures within our news organizations. But I finally decided to share something that keeps me up at night and have deep implications for our democracy, which is the evolving perception that speech and the press shouldn't be free. That the right to speak and disseminate information should be limited to certain organizations or individuals. In short, that the First Amendment rights should be granted selectively. Make no mistake, this is not a phenomenon limited to certain groups located in the extremes of the political spectrum. Unfortunately, the belief that only those that agree with me have the right to talk and be amplified has permeated all levels of society. And let me give you a quick example of how this plays out. A couple of months ago, we were broadcasting a press conference by the President of the United States. It included something that unfortunately has become routine in this exercises, which is demeaning exchanges between the president and members of the press, where the president criticizes the press for asking questions about his handling of the pandemic, as well to references to fake news as qualifier for stories that he doesn't agree with. And about halfway into it, we receive an email from an individual that identified as a member of our station and demanded in all caps, and I'm quoting, "Take him off the air or else," end of quote. And by him, he referred to the President of the United States. It was a direct threat to our organization. Unfortunately, I have many other examples of situations where members of the public and policymakers have demanded and in some cases have used intimidation tactics to curtail the freedom of the press. This selective application of the rights afforded by the First Amendment impedes the civil discourse and exchange of ideas that are at the center of democracy. As individuals, we have to understand the great contradiction that is upholding the right to free speech and the right to petition our government for redress, and at the same time, limit the work of news organizations trying to cover the protests that we're participating in. Some are going to point out the limitations slash biases slash structures of power coloring the work of news organizations. And as a queer Latina, I'll be the first one to say that we aren't perfect, and there's a lot of work to be done to correct the sins of the past. News organizations need to understand that the freedoms accorded to the press come with great responsibility, and they have to use them accordingly. But my call today is for us to understand that these ideals, and in particular freedom of speech and freedom of the press, are at the heart of our democracy and shouldn't be compromised, even when we don't like what other people are saying. Listening to one another makes us better citizens and better human beings. That dream, that possibility is something worth defending. So I'm gonna open the floor to our great panel. The way that we have structured the conversation today is that each member of the panel is gonna have between 5 to 7 minutes to make a quick presentation, and then we're gonna open the floor for your questions and comments. Do you guys want me to call on anybody, or do I have a volunteer? Scott, you seem very smiley. Want to go first?
We're just like the students we complain about when we all hide toward the end. No, this is a wonderful panel, and thank you all for keeping me on this in spite of the smart person requirement. I don't think I meet that threshold, but I have a couple slides, not anything profound, no cat memes, but there are a few passages from one of my favorite philosophers, John Dewey, and I want to use these to kind of ground what I'm going to say over the next 5 or 7 minutes. So I believe I have rights to do this. You should see some great thoughts. I'm Scott Stroud. I'm an associate professor in the Communications Studies department here at Moody. I'm also the program director of media ethics at the Center for Media Engagement, and you could find the media ethics tweets on ethics of media. We just released our 100th free case study for educators here and elsewhere to use. And free speech is a wonderful topic, and I'm glad we're engaging it. My engagement is different from some other folks you will see. I'm not as interested in the legal aspects of it. These are undoubtedly important, but I'm extremely interested in the ethical aspects. What does it mean for me to value or devalue your speech? And how should I respond to speech I like or don't like in a democracy? These are ethical questions, right? Because they apply to speech we don't throw people in jail for. Okay, so let me ask this question. What is democracy? Now, this is nothing we can answer in 7 minutes, but typically folks believe or start to answer this and they look at structures. They look at structures of voting. They look at structures of decision-making. They look at who is included in these structures. These are very periodic structures when legislatures meet, when policymakers decide stuff. Now, this is obviously an important aspect of democracy, but the aspect I think is relevant to get into focus when we talk about the ethical aspects of speech is something else. And it comes to the forefront in one of my favorite philosophers, John Dewey. And John Dewey, many people have read him, but he has some wonderful work. He has too many words, 8 million or so. And one of his best pieces is a short speech he wrote in 1939 called Creative Democracy. And in this speech, he makes it painfully clear what his stance on democracy is. Democracy is not a voting procedure. It's a way of life. And what that means is the possession and continual use of certain attitudes, forming personal character and determining desire and purpose in all the relations of life. So that happens much more often than every 4 years. So in the Deweyan notion of democracy, what happens when we act democratically or not democratically happens much more on Twitter, let's say, or Facebook than it does when we go to the voting booth. Both are important, but one is the everyday way of life being enacted. Now, what does it mean to act in a way that enshrines the habits of democracy? Dewey continues, and I highlight the important parts, namely to take as far as possible every conflict which arises out of the atmosphere and medium of force, of violence as a means to settlement, and into that of discussion and intelligence is to treat those who disagree, even profoundly with us, as those from whom we may learn, and insofar as friends. He continues, intolerance, abuse, calling of names because of differences of opinion about religion, politics, or business, as well as because of differences of race, color, wealth, or degree of culture, are treason to the democratic way of life. Now, he's writing this right as the Nazis become apparent for the fascists they are to the world, before the US entry into World War II, but when everyone in the US knew something evil was afoot in the heart of Europe. So even though he has the easy target of fascists to point at, he's talking about any intolerance here. And he says for everything, he's talking about on this side of the Atlantic as well as that side, which bars freedom and fullness of communication and sets up barriers that divide human beings into sets and cliques, that undermines the democratic way of life. And then, and this is the last passage I'll draw from this wonderful speech, but he says, merely legal guarantees of the civil liberty of free belief, free expression, free assembly, the First Amendment, are going to be choked by mutual suspicion, abuse, and fear and hatred if we have the wrong sets of habits. And he draws our attention towards the idea that open coercion only works when we have the right kind of attitudes underlying these of suspicion, division, and hatred. So my point, and I'll leave it at this because I know it's provocative, and I know the point of our little quick, talks here to provoke further discussion. But what I lean towards is what is intimated by this view of democracy and its ideals. The idea that we should have more speech, not less speech, and that part of the challenge of this atmosphere of speech is how do we reconcile ourselves to people we think are hateful, intolerant, wrong, evil, out to get us, whatever opponent or enemyship label you want to put on them. So that seems to be the fundamental problem or challenge of democracy, right? How to get along with people you dislike. So it's easy for us to always say, let's maximize speech to let 1,000 flowers bloom, but not those people. And we always point at someone who typically points right back at us. So this is the challenge of speech and the ideals of democracy. How do we use speech as a testing ground for our own democratic habits? How do we react appropriately and effectively to those that don't have those habits and those that disagree with us? So I'll leave it at that. I'm excited to see this discussion go down, and I'm excited to hear what my sharp panelists have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Mary, do you want to go? Do you want to be the next one?
Sure. I am the resident visual scholar, I think, on this panel. And one of the reasons that I wanted to participate in the panel was to discuss the differences between words and image, and to try to get people to think a little bit about how important it is for us to be visible, but then also the responsibilities that come with visibility. Some of my concerns, things that I'd like to perhaps engender some more discussion about, is freedom of information laws regarding visual information. It's still very, the laws of access to the public visual information varies widely from municipality to municipality. I'm thinking about things like police badge cam video, which I think that there's 8 petabytes of police video that have been uploaded to different kinds of storage systems, for instance, in different cities. And there's a variance of laws that allow people to be able to see this video. The public doesn't always have the right to see it. Sometimes it's released, sometimes it's not, sometimes it should not be released, but the laws on this are still unformed. We still don't really know where we stand, even though badge cam video has been seen as one of the most important tools for police accountability. At the same time, I also study cop watchers and the ethics of cop watching and the ethics of police accountability on the street, and who has the right to access those kinds of scenes. The Supreme Court has ruled that being able to visually record your government and action in public places is part of the First Amendment. You have the First Amendment right to do this. There are certain responsibilities that come with this as well, because now that we are all journalists participating online. If we are posting, if we are tweeting, if we're posting, if we are participating on Facebook and producing videos, we are essentially committing journalistic acts, which means that there is an entire set of ethical principles that need to be in place if what we're doing is to support democracy and not merely be our individual right to express ourselves. There's 2 sides to this equation, and somebody who goes out saying that they're cop watching, but only, for instance, makes video of somebody who is clearly in distress, clearly perhaps mentally ill, clearly having a breakdown, and then posts that to YouTube, has every right under the First Amendment to do that. The question is, how does that serve the public? How does that serve the democracy in doing so? And I think that because visuals operate differently in communication, visuals are more memorable, visuals cause a more emotional response. They attract our attention differently. We can't unsee things. And now that images can live forever online, I would just like to really start having a stronger conversation when we talk about freedom of speech, that we also talk about voice and visibility. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Mary. Lots, lots of notes. I have a couple of questions about what you just said. Mirasol, do you want to go next?
Sure, I think it's a great segue talking about this idea of voice. So first, thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity to speak with you all today. It's a real pleasure. So I'm the acting director of the Latino Media Arts and Studies program, and I also teach in RTF and malls. But I want to start by saying that, like Scott saying, I come at this not from a legal perspective, right? I'm in the exact same boat. I come at this from a perspective of someone who is committed to social justice and really devoted to supporting filmmakers and artists of color, folks in underrepresented groups of all kinds. So whether it's the research, the classes, or my work as an arts administrator, it's about amplifying voices, right, of underrepresented populations. And I say this because I think it's important to know I've come to consider this idea of free speech, not again from this legal perspective, but as someone who loves art and film and media and who values creativity. It's just so important on an individual level, of course, but also for the well-being of our communities. The well-being of our communities is significantly impacted by our abilities to harness the power of art and media to make real and lasting change in the world. And I teach this class on Latinx media, arts, and activism. And one of the things I try to emphasize in the class is that we are all creative beings, whatever that means to you, right? And it's a fundamental right. It's not a luxury. It's important on a personal level to bring you joy and make you whole, and so that you feel personal growth, but it allows us to connect, to have an impact on the world around us. Our creativity, when that's stifled, it shuts down a part of ourselves. We're not our full selves, our quality of life image, and it affects the well-being of our communities. So freedom of speech, freedom of information, freedom of expression, these are all intertwined, right? And they're fundamental rights. And for a democracy to function, you really need to be able to obtain information about political and social issues, be informed about what's happening to your rights, and be able to communicate freely in all kinds of different ways. So where our government's accountable to people, to make sure everyone has this sort of equal say, whether it's voting or, electing public officials and this kind of stuff, we also just need to be able to voice opinions, express dissent, and participate in this public sphere. Discussing issues in a public forum where people have opportunities to influence public opinion is incredibly important. So, media and the arts have been central to all kinds of social movements, the Chicano and Puerto Rican civil rights movements, for example. Media and art, they just provided the foundation for empowering communities, providing a means to communicate internally and also disseminate information. Holding authorities accountable for their actions is just so important and effective. And media is hugely important in this moment when we live in an absolutely media-saturated environment. So then the question is, how do we protect our freedom of speech today? Because what freedom of speech protections look like, that changes according to the moment, right? How do we assure that people have this equal say? And freedom of speech and expression are part of that. Social and economic equality are also very important. Some people have more access to information than others. Some people have, their opinions valued more than others. And there are all kinds of inequities that affect how different people and communities' voices are valued and how much influence they have on the policies and the laws, for example, that have huge impacts on their lives. So what I really want to talk about is how do we facilitate, right, freedom of speech, like, you know, free speech. Free speech isn't really free in any sense of the word, really. I think about that saying, if common sense were so common, then everyone would have it, right? Free speech is kind of the same. If free speech were really speech, everyone would have equal ability to not just speak, but be heard, have an equal opportunity to shape the public discourse and participate in the public sphere. But that is not the case. We all know that some voices are louder than others, and the reasons for that vary, but one of the reasons is access to resources. And so what I think about all the time when I'm here on this panel, or at least why I think I'm on this panel, is because of the work that I do to try to get artists and media makers access to resources so that they can, one, exercise their right to express themselves as creative beings, but also so that they can take an active role in shaping the public discourse and, you know, around the issues of social and political import. So they can tell their stories and create community and be part of a dialogue to move people to action and make, you know, change that will better their communities. So I think in today's environment, it's really easy for people to say, well, freedom of speech exists, right? And you have a cell phone, you can go and say what you want. You can post it all over Facebook if you want. You're fine, you can say whatever you want. But we really do have to think about this and think about how much access does everybody really have? And the pandemic has really, I think, you know, exposed, you know, this idea about, you know, there's all kinds of issues around connectivity. Does everyone have reliable access to the internet or fast internet to support video? What if you go to the library to get access? You know, what kind of tools do you have so that you can make sure that your voice is heard? So whether it's social media or filmmaking equipment or whatever it is, we have to think about where do people get their information, their knowledge, their training, and how do we make sure that resources are available to people in all kinds of communities so that they can tell their stories? Because the sea of voices out there at this point is wide and deep, right? It's huge. Just saying that you're able to speak does not mean that you'll be heard. And unequal access to resources is one of the things that affects who's heard. So programs and policies that help get resources in the hands of underrepresented communities are huge when we talk about freedom of speech. And this is why I became involved with the Community Media Center here in town, Austin Public, that I oversaw their education programs there. And part of my work there was trying to find ways to put resources that the city provides into the hands of people who need them. So filmmaking equipment, training on how to use that equipment, access to mentors, right, to each other so they can help each other. And another big issue is, right, when we have these programs, we have these resources, nobody's going to be able to use the resources if they don't know they exist. So for organizations who have resources to share, part of the work is also to design effective outreach programs. So building trust and working with disenfranchised communities whose experience has taught them that their voices are not valued. That is another really important part of the work, I think, that we need to pay attention to. So it's not enough to just say, hey, the resources are here, just come and use them. Just like it's not enough to say, hey, you have a voice, go ahead and use it, right? We need to have more programs and more policies that put those resources into the hands of people who need them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mirasol. Very interesting, your reference to how important it is access and who has access to the resources at this time to amplify their voices. And Sam,
yeah.
you're the one person left.
Yeah, well, thank you all very much. I think this is fascinating, and I think that I'm glad to go last because I think I'm going to be a little provocative here. I'm a scholar of social media, so I study the internet, and I also study propaganda, and I also study disinformation. And in my studies, I find that in the era of the internet, we have to rethink the ways in which we think about free speech, because the internet is a tremendously powerful tool. And the ways in which communication happens online are not equal. I think that Mirasol's points that she made were absolutely fantastic. I think that online we see the same things playing out, that a lot of people who are marginalized do not get a chance to speak very much online, and that we see people getting a chance to speak online that have more resources, that have more access to money, to know-how, and that can be a problem. I absolutely believe in free speech. I think that people should have the right to criticize their government no matter what. That being said, I do think that there are some serious questions that we have to ask ourselves about hate speech in the current era. And I think that that the online sphere makes this as clear as anywhere. We see today, for instance, I released a collaborative study with the Anti-Defamation League in which we see a tremendous amount of anti-Semitic, anti-Black content on Facebook and Telegram. I teach media law in the School of Journalism, among my other duties. And one of the things that we talk about is this concept of the legitimacy argument, which is this argument that that there's a wide-ranging right to freedom of expression that makes the democratic process function. But the thing is the legitimacy argument doesn't really work if everyone doesn't have access to be able to speak. If people have unequal access, if the Black community has unequal access, if the Latino community has unequal access, if gay people aren't allowed to speak up in our country, that's a problem. And when hate speech occurs against those groups, when those groups are constantly attacked, as we see online because of things like anonymity and automation, the attacks on those groups of people are scaled, and they happen in ways that are much more silencing and much more sort of alienating than ever before. We don't see free speech playing out. Part of the problem that we experience right now is that the US government's basically washed its hand of attempting to regulate the online sphere. The government's basically said, we're not going to work to regulate at least communication during elections or communication about politics online. And there's these few little words called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that basically allow internet companies to both take down content that they see as fit, but also to not be held liable for the speech that occurs on their platforms. And this is all presupposed on the idea that this bit of law that was written in the mid-90s, well before social media ever got created, presupposes the fact that these aren't actually media companies that do mediate information that we see. And they absolutely do. There's these things called trends, right? There's recommendations. There's things that algorithms recommend that we see. And that therefore curates the kinds of news and content that we have access to. It makes it possible for someone like Donald Trump to become much more popular in a system wherein virality is an unequal game, where the playing field is not level. And so these are problems, right? And these are problems that we have to ask ourselves about our informational ecosystem. Is our informational ecosystem built in such a way nowadays that everyone has a right to have an equal voice? Or as Mirasol said, are some voices a lot louder than others? I would contend that some voices are a lot louder than others. And so, you know, there's been for a long time, there's been this debate, right? Which is, does having criminalized hate speech undermine democracy? And in Europe, the answer's been no. In Canada, the answer's been no. In other democracies around the world, the answer has been no. In the United States, it's always been yes. We don't want to criminalize hate speech. But the thing is, with the internet and with the anonymity that comes with the internet, speech looks a little bit different. And, you know, I find it's a really hard thing to talk about because free speech is almost one of these, it's not only an unalienable right that Americans hold dear, it's also something that is sacrosanct to Americans. But I'm by no means a constitutional originalist or a Bill of Rights originalist. I think that these laws should change. I think that we have to think about the changes that happen in our media, and in order to protect those that are most marginalized and to protect those that are most under siege from this stuff. Noel Newman had a concept, spiral of silence, right? Spiral of silence. What happens when there's so much hate and vitriol online? There's so much problematic content. There's so much conspiracy theory from groups like QAnon that people no longer feel like they actually have the ability to speak freely. Just some questions. I don't have the answers. I think that we have to work to regulate the online sphere more. I think the government has a really tough job to do. And I don't think we should leave it in the hands of the social media companies themselves to figure out how to do this, because they've shown that they're inept.
Thank you, Sam.
Yep.
Provocative indeed. So it's 2:37. I'm going to ask one question to the panel, and then we're going to open for the participants to ask questions. And my question is related to the New York Times piece published this weekend, which was precisely about freedom of speech. And one of the arguments that the author makes is that freedom of speech in this era is being silenced not by the lack of access, but actually by so many voices. And mention bots and mention all of the resources that work together, trolls that work together to kind of silence certain voices. And I wanted to hear what the panel has to say about this concept.
I'll start. Because again, with visuals, there's an interesting thing that happens online, and because of digitization. And digitization has not just leveled the playing field for access. Digitization has also leveled the playing field for production value. So I am old, and I grew up knowing, anybody old enough to know who Lyndon LaRouche was? So there was a guy who ran for president year after year after year, and he was way out there on the political spectrum. I'm not even sure how to classify Lyndon LaRouche, but you could always tell a LaRouche when I was young, because they had hand-drawn signs with lots of yellow. Their posters looked like ransom notes. They looked goofy. And the early aspects of the web, when somebody had some far out falsehoods, propaganda that they wanted to put together, they looked like LaRouche posters. Today, digitization has made everything look smooth and professional. And you can make the most crazy, balderdash, lying claims, but they will look as beautifully produced as anything that comes out of a professional, long-standing, traditional media corporation. And the look also seduces people just as much as the words. So because it looks so professionally done, it can also seduce people in really troubling ways. And so that's another aspect of digitization that is a problem that I think that the New York Times hinted at, but I'm going to throw it out there too.
Thank you, Mary. I think indirectly, one of the things that you're talking about is how traditionally there's been a difference between members of the press and regular citizens, right? And you had to fulfill certain attributes in order to be considered a member of the press and have access to shield laws, et cetera, including accuracy in your work, including attribution, including balance. There was a series of conditions to be considered a media, but now technology has kind of lowered that threshold. So how do you distinguish? Is interesting, because I think and I have it in one of my notes that one of you mentioned, oh, somebody is committing a journalistic act by publishing on a platform, and my answer as a journalist is, but not only, our work is beyond just publishing on a platform, and it part of the blame is on us for not educating the public in everything that goes into each story, but it's just the mere act of using the platform doesn't make you a journalist.
It doesn't make you a journalist, but it does, that people still have the same access to the audience, and it looks the same.
Exactly.
The problem.
Yeah. So hence the traditional line has been erased or is diffused by this. Okay, I see two questions in the Q&A chat. I want to remind everybody in the audience that on the lower part of your screen, there should be a Q&A icon, and you can submit your question. The first one is from Cheryl, and she said, comment not question, in my thinking, that cancel culture is a huge issue in the soft denial of free speech that frequently results in shaming or loss of job/social standing. Seems like this question has your name, Sam.
I I don't know, Mirasol or Mary or Scott, if you have any comments on this. I'm not sure that I have a particular stance. I think it's a very dicey issue. What I will say is that the cancel culture is also something that's kind of been weaponized by people in politics. Like, it's like this kind of conversation about like, well, should we get rid of people, or should we say we're not going to endorse people that have done wrong? In which case, absolutely. You know, if we're talking about you know, the Jeffrey Epsteins of the world, like, there's a big time reason to cancel these sorts of people. But we still live in a rule of law, and we still have to go through the legal process. And cancel culture, you know, is a version of something that we see in propaganda and disinformation, which is the attempt to attack or to defame someone's reputation. And it's something that's used in politics all the time. It's something that the Russians have used for a really long time in their own politics. And so we have to be really careful about where the call to cancel is coming from. And we have to be sure that we know what the intentions are there, because it can be a political tool that gets used, and that can be really worrying.
I was gonna say, yeah, this is a vexing issue, and it's particularly challenging in the ethical aspect, right? Because most of the instances of, you know, people getting canceled or even doxxed aren't illegal in the technical sense. I mean, someone's address is not protected information, or me pointing out some flaws here to someone over here is not. You know, so it's an interesting question, because it's the use of counter speech against someone else's probably expressive conduct. But you know, there's a deeper ethical issue here. My firm commitment is most of the things we find as ethically problematic in some new technology probably has pretty identifiable roots before that technology. There's not much new under the sun, in other words. And so there's this human, nature tendency to like seek revenge and get people. And the internet just makes it easier to see things that you want to have that reaction to amongst people you don't share a room with, and to, you know, multiply your voice and actually do something about it versus just complaining over a beer. So you can start Twitter storms, you can go to certain blogs that are oriented towards getting racists fired, and, you know, get a virtual group together that tries to affect that end. And so it's a vexing ethical question, because I don't think it's in the spirit of democracy. You know, to make your enemies less effective seems to be a strategy just to embolden your enemies more against you, whether they're racists, Democrats, Republicans, whoever's on the other side of your aisle. So the Deweyan ideal is, how do you bring these folks together? And it's difficult, because, you know, you don't want to just let them be in some cases.
Agree. It's kind of a dark topic. Mirasol, I just wanted to ask if you, because of your work with in access and guaranteeing access, if you had some thoughts about intimidation and what role does it play in certain communities?
Yeah, I mean, I like it's troubling. I don't know how much more to say about it, except that it's just such an unfortunate thing, that the way that it shuts down conversations that help people grow. Right. None of us, I think one of the real problems here is that we seem to have a problem realizing and accepting that none of us are perfect either, especially in this moment. Right. And I think you sort of alluded to that just a little while ago, right, when you're saying, well, we're not perfect. Right. Like, I think all of us need to do more of that and say more of that and allow each other, you know, this idea that we are in a moment where we have the ability to be civil, right? This is all a civil society, right? Where's the civility? And our inability to do that right now, the way that is just spiraling out of control, and the way that it's hampering conversations that are really necessary in order to move us forward. The effects that it's having even within the university systems, right? I see it happening all the time with my students, among faculty even, just being a little bit afraid to talk about these things that have always been difficult things to talk about, and that's our work, right? And we're now in a moment where it's just a scary time. I don't know what else to say about it. And I thank all of you for being here and for engaging in the conversations. Everybody's, you know, just setting a model for how it can be done, right?
Thank you, Mirasol. I have Let's continue with the next question, which is from Craig. And it says, I'm wondering what you think about the role of surveillance society. Is that potentially a free speech right to monitor others? And or is it something that has a significant chilling effect on free speech? Thank you for your thought.
Well, surveillance comes with surveillance. And I think, when we talk about the First Amendment, which granted individual citizens the right to speak, that part of that is surveillance, which is the look from below. And that really gets to what I'm concerned about with who has access to visuality in the digital age, who has access to see what authorities see, who has access to understand how and when we're being surveilled by authorities, and who has the right to then counter surveil or use surveillance. These are important issues that have not been adequately hammered out and settled. We do have the right under, I think it's 5 appeals courts, but the Supreme Court has not yet ruled on whether or the cop watching right, but 5 appeals courts have, that we have the right to monitor our government visually. But the right to visuality and to see and to use cameras comes with a lot of responsibilities. There are places where cameras do not belong, but there are places in public life where cameras clearly do belong. Legislatures, city councils, those kinds of places, which actually often prohibit citizen cameras in favor of camera systems and CCTV systems that they control. And so I'm somewhat obsessed with who controls what we see and how. And these are absolutely not settled. And these conversations, well, to my mind, are not taking place often enough.
Well,
That's
this
an
is one.
interesting. Oh, go ahead.
Go, Scott.
I was going to say that's an interesting, different way of saying this. Usually I think of it the other way, which is there an ethical or legal right or expectation or desire for the anonymity of speakers? But to say like, do I have a right to know who's saying what? That's tricky. I mean, obviously I have a strategic reason. I could evaluate the information and sources of potential bias if I know who's saying it. But this is Dr. Scott's question is really orbiting around the real tricky area of anonymity online. And it's just one of those things that clearly shows you ethics is about complex matters, because anonymity allows sexual or gender minorities the right to speak without some community, perhaps their real life one, making bad or inaccurate judgments of what deserves to be punished, or canceled, if you will. So this is kind of the double-edged sword of anonymity. You can't evaluate what they're after with this, but on the other hand, it protects a certain group of folks. It's always changing and ambiguous depending on circumstances from repercussions and the chilling effects that come with them.
And also what you were saying, Mary, is very interesting because one of the dilemmas that we were facing this summer was when we were covering the protests that were happening in Austin around racial justice. There was a lot of demands from people made through phone calls, emails, and messages on social media, demanding that we do not identify or even broadcast the faces or the names of people that were leading these protests, and in some cases were very visual or were very, very visual at the forefront of them. But they, so there's the question of, on one part, as media, we strive always for, remember that that one of the criteria is attribution, and we avoid as much as we can, and it's only under special circumstances that we allow anonymity. But then it's disingenuous to think, or it would be disingenuous to tell these people or assume that they don't necessarily will face consequences for having their image or their faces or their names being broadcast in the media as being part of this protest. So there was this tension in our newsroom as to how do we handle this in an ethical and thoughtful way, understanding that there might be repercussions, but also adhering to our our ethical principles and to ethical journalistic standards. So I don't have a a one size fits all blanket. We did, but it's one of those questions that we have in the air right now in newsrooms.
Indeed. I think it was the Reynolds Institute held a roundtable discussion on this very instance, what to do and how to photograph marginalized people, and what needs to be done with protests, and a great deal of discussion over who has power to harm and who has power to not harm, and who has power in these instances and what harm can come of photography. And the professional press, the professional photojournalists, still absolutely believe that if you are raising your voice in a public place, then you may be photographed for journalism. At the same time, the members of the photographic press, as part of this panel, also discussed the need for sensitivity and awareness of the harm that can come to people who have less power in society who are protesting. And they suggested a number of different ways to fairly cover such protests, mostly by maintaining relationships, by staying on the ground for a long time, not playing helicopter photographer. Whoop, here I am, taking a few shots, great, see you, bye. But maintaining relationships with the people who are protesting, knowing on the ground who is doing what, and having a sense of who might be harmed and who might not be harmed. And there's no absolute answer to this. But the professional press did come down on the overall rule. If you are acting in public, then attribution and accuracy requires us to document that fairly and completely.
Guys, is that all? Well, this is what I learned when I was a cover reporter, which is, that is there an expectation of privacy in it? And if not, then it's usually free. I mean, you can use it. We have one question from Emma, and it's directed towards Sam, but I do think that other members of the panel can certainly participate on this. And the question is, how would you suppose we mandate hate speech? I'm struggling to see how you don't think it would limit our rights in a democracy. Who arbitrates it?
Great question. So to be clear, speech is limited in the United States already. There are limits on what you can do and say. There are certain protected groups and protected classes. So, for instance, you can't discriminate or harass people based upon their religion or their creed or their sex. And those things matter, right? And so, for instance, the FBI right now during this election is making sure that those sorts of groups aren't being actively harassed during our election. It's just the ways in which that kind of regulation happens are very unsystematic, especially when it comes to the online sphere. There's another thing too, which is the fact that, there's other forms of speech that are not protected. So incitement to violence is one of them. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There's the classic one. And the other thing is you can't spread disinformation, purposefully false information about how, when, or where to vote. You can't misinform people about the electoral process. But a lot of these things are things that we see every day online. They're things that happen in a massive way across Twitter, YouTube, you name it. They're on the social media platforms, and the social media platforms are struggling to deal with it. The question is, how would you define hate speech now? So how would you define hate speech? This is a question for the courts, right? There's a reason why we have a judiciary, and the judiciary's job is to arbitrate the law. Defining hate speech, would be defined as in hate speech against protected groups. So if you're targeting people because of their religion, if you're targeting Muslims, for instance, or if you're targeting Christians, then you are committing an act of hate speech or an act of hate.
I mean, I disagree with what Sam said about hate speech. I mean, I don't think there are legally, we're not Canada, right? There's no legal protections for groups, or India. We can have the Book of Mormon play here, right? We don't have any laws against impugning the dignity of religious groups or inciting animosity among religious groups. But I mean, most of us probably want these folks, these, KKK sites or whatever, taken off. And so, yeah, I doubt the courts will ever define this. What they've come up to now is that would amount to viewpoint discrimination. So it's my reading of the law is it's totally legal to be a racist and to say racist things. Now, maybe there are some election laws and such that, you know, if I say voting's on Wednesday, I run afoul of that. That's an interesting test, Sam. You know, if that got up the courts, would that law get struck down on First Amendment grounds, right? You can claim you're a combat veteran with decorations and it'd be a lie. And that law was struck down against that. So I have no hope that the courts will ever define hate speech like Canada says this group, anything, or Indian Constitution or the German Constitution. I mean, the ethical question is trickier. You know, is there some kind of definition of what it means to be hate speech?
I think what I'm more concerned about, rather than having sort of like hate speech be defined as sort of like making fun of a particular religion, as we see in like some of the European countries, like with the Charlie Hebdo situation in France, more along the lines of any type of incitement to violence or threats towards these classes. And we haven't historically seen a lot of action taken in those situations. And I think we need to see more action taken. The New York Times just released a report, for instance, that the Latino and Black Lives Matter communities are being sort of pitted against each other on social media. And that it turns out that the people who are pitting them against each other are right-wing extremists. And that's a major problem.
Well,
yeah.
This also just reminds me of, it brings to mind the obscenity, right? What is obscene? It's what's obscene to one person, right? It's what's offensive to regular people. Like, who's the regular person, right? And the idea that like, well, what's obscene to one person versus another person, hate speech, like how do you define hate speech? I mean, I think we all have, there are some things that are clearly hate speech. And there are people who say, well, oh, that, you know, where is the line that we draw? It wasn't meant in this kind of hateful way. It was joking, or it's this or it's that. But the idea that like, when I was working at public access, right, in terms of what's obscene, what ended up being obscene was whatever people called in and complained about, right? So there could be something totally obscene, right? When many people would say obscene, but if nobody called in and complained about it, it would continue and go on and go on, right? So what happened when you think about hate speech too, like, it's like it has to get recognized, called out, and this is where this call out culture on some level comes from too, right? So it calls to mind that, and how do you define things and then do something about it? So those legal, like I said, I don't come from the legal point. I don't envy anybody's job on having to figure that stuff out. I just don't want people to be hateful. You would think it's common sense, but alas, it's not so common.
I mean, what's even more challenging, right, is the online world. What's a death threat on Twitter? There's so much trash that's said on Twitter. If I come to your front door and say some of this stuff, that's a true threat, not protected speech legally. But on Twitter, people say all kinds of awful things. I hope you get disease X and die. Is that really an actionable course of threat? I mean, it is pitting someone against you. Everyone say this about that group. It's unclear if it's the same as a threat. So in some ways, the internet allows us to get in people's faces more and tweet at them. So it's a fascinatingly sad area to study. I'm sure Sam feels it's all the misinformation stuff. You get depressed.
Yeah, undoubtedly. Yeah, you know, it's a big challenge, and there's no easy answers here. And Scott, I don't think I have an easy answer to what you're saying, and I'm sure you don't either, really, because it's a big challenge.
Unfortunately, it's 3:01. Just when we're getting to interesting topics, but I wanted to. I know that some people in our panel have to have a hard stop. So I want to thank Mary, Scott, Mirasol, Sam, and the folks at the Moody School for organizing this panel and giving us the opportunity to talk briefly about some of the issues that keep us up at night and that get us passionate and get us going. And I'm looking forward to continue the conversation with all of you guys. I'm certainly making a lot of notes, so I hope we can follow up. Thank you very much to all the participants for your questions, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.